Greetings and welcome back to Room 3 and 3 and our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the Johnson edition of the 1,775 poems of Emily Dickinson. Let's turn now to poem 28. It's a remarkable little poem. So has a daisy vanished. We're going to have something to say about that very first word, so, when we get there. Now, this is Emily at her theological best, at her theological, ontological, epistemological best. She's a curious mind, and we're going to see that curious mind represented in this poem. And of course she's going to speak to the human condition that so many of us deal with, the questions of course of afterlife. What happens when one dies? Is it nothing? Is it something? And if so, what? So we're going to play that game. Now our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you we're exposed to our introductory set of comments, our intro lecture. For example, I just mentioned ontological, epistemological, and I'm hopeful that you at least have some sense of what I'm talking about, because we're going to talk about that through this lecture, and I'm hopeful that you already have some background knowledge there. And as long with that, I'm hopeful that you've already worked with the first 27 poems of our edition, Mourns Like These, poem 27, we just finished with. Now again, our background information here is to, first of all, remind ourselves that Emily is very interested in questions about death and afterlife. It's not so much that she's morbid all the time about dying and death, but rather, much like Plato in his dialogue Phaedo, Socrates is curious about what happens in the afterlife. So we're going to play that game here, immortality and the like. Also, we'd like to think about her representation of flowers and the symbolism of flowers. Daisies, for example, they are a remarkable flower because they can symbolize what? Graves and dying and death. But they can also, and I'm attributing some of this to my Emily group who's pointing this out to me, they can also, of course, represent innocence, purity, and the like. Let's go ahead now and enjoy the poem. And we're going to hear a number of echoes in this poem later in our other studies, and we'll try and point those out as we go. So has a daisy vanished from the fields today, so tiptoed many a slipper to paradise away, oozed so in crimson bubbles day's departing tide, blooming, tripping, flowing. Are ye then with God? Now it is interesting to ask whether God and tide in any way rhyme at all. I think it does work as slant rhyme, and we're going to enjoy the game that she will play with language here, as in a rhetorical question to a daisy that has vanished. Of course, we're speaking symbolically, right? To what degree is there such a thing as afterlife? Okay, now, of course, the way she asks this question is going to be typical brilliant genius Emily. So let's enjoy it as we go. I want to start, first of all, with the word so. Now, when you look, there are 14 times total in the Johnson edition that Emily will use this word for the first word of a poem. So has a daisy vanished. We'll see it again in poem 66, So from the Mold. The poem will run like this. I love this little poem. So from the mold, scarlet and gold, many a bulb will rise, hidden away cunningly from sagacious eyes. So from cocoon, there's a repetition of this word. Many a worm leaps, so, the third time it gets used in 66, Highland gay, peasants like me, peasants like thee, gaze perplexedly. That word perplexedly is a perfect word correlate to this word. The question is, okay, so, and it's interesting to me the way that so became a filler in language in the 20th and now the 21st century. You notice this? People go so, and then they'll start talking, so, and then they'll start talking. I think they might have learned some of this from Emily herself. It's an interesting filler, and it's a great way to start a speculative kind of poem like this. So has a daisy vanished. Go back to poem 22 when she referenced daisies and some of our comments there. And of course the idea of vanishing is going to be central to this poem. From the fields, notice its immediacy, now today. So, and 3 words are going to get used in this poem that never get used anywhere else in her canon. It's quite remarkable. Tiptoed is the first one. So tiptoed many a slipper to paradise away. When we get to poem 95, we'll hear about the patient till paradise line. You can run that one to ground. We'll certainly study it when we hit poem 95. The idea of tiptoeing is wonderful, and of course the use of slippers. It's almost a childlike quality. We're back to the innocence of daisies, no question. But then the second stanza, the word oozed only gets used one time in all of Leaves of Grass, and it's right here. Oozed so in crimson bubbles. This idea of blood, maybe? The idea of repetition of the use of red as a color over and over again. Days departing tide, and then all of a sudden it makes you wonder, is she talking about blood, or is she talking about a blood-red evening sky? In other words, oh, now we're to the end of the day and the understanding of the symbolism that's being played there. So tiptoed many a slipper to paradise away, oozed so in crimson bubbles. That's this, oozed is the second word of this poem, along with tiptoed, that will only be used one time in all of her poetry. Oozed so in crimson bubbles, days departing tide, and then notice her trinities, her threes. Blooming, tripping, flowing. By the way, tripping only gets used one time in all of her poetry, and it's right here. Blooming, tripping, flowing, different ways to think about vanishing, right? You can think about flowers, daisies blooming. You can think about the tripping and the tiptoeing. You can think about the river and the tide flowing. It's quite brilliant the way she plays this game. All of that to come to, of course, the penultimate line. Are ye, notice the religious language, then with God? Now, this is a fascinating rhetorical question. Of course, it's difficult to get an answer, right? This notion of being with God is an idea that she's going to come back to again and again and again. In poem 1052, she'll say it this way. In 1052, she says it this way. I never saw a moor, I never saw the sea, yet know I how the heather looks, and what a billow it be. I never spoke with God, nor visited in heaven, yet certain am I of the spot, as if the checks were given. This idea of I never spoke with God is this construction. Poem 643, she'll say it this way. 'Twas face to face with nature forced, 'twas face to face with God. In poem 844, she's going to play this game. But during March and April, nor stir abroad without a cordial interview with God. And then finally in poem 924, we'll have her say it this way. Taste death, the first to hand the sting, the second to its friend, disarms the little interval, disposits him with God. This is love is that later thing than death. Deposits him with God. So this construction with God is one that she's going to play with as speculation about theology and the like. Well, what are we going to do with a little poem like this at 2a? I think her argument is that it's very difficult to know what happens post-death. It isn't so clear to her exactly what's going on, but she would like to know. Her curiosity is central to this poem. At 2b, I love her word choice. The fact that tiptoed, oozed, and tripping never appear in another poem, and yet here they are together. I love her construction of with God. I love that 14 poems will start with this so word. It's almost like, you know what I mean? Like, I wonder, so. At 3a, I love all of the poems that we were just now referencing. This speculation about what happens. Obviously, Plato's Phaedo comes to mind immediately. And the question of being with God or with deity, is that legitimate or not? Finally, at 3b, obviously to own a poem like this, what do you think about what happens in afterlife? And how does that square with your view of living? And to what degree is Emily challenging you to think differently about life and afterlife? I hope that's happening. Thank you.